Hello and a very warm welcome to this thematic jam session. My name is Andreas Schleicher. I'm Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, and I will be your moderator today. We all know that everything starts and stops with money, and also that the fiscal context is going to be extremely tight in the years to come. So we have been given the difficult task to find ways to protect domestic and also international financing for education in this session. Just reiterating that education is important and that our schools today are going to be our economy and society tomorrow will not be enough. What the next generation will expect from us in this session is to come up with actionable strategies that are based on very concrete experiences and also lessons learned. There are three financing commitments for us to reflect on. You have seen them in the draft declaration that was sent to you last week. The first basically commits countries to increase or at least maintain the share of public expenditure on education in accordance of what was established as a benchmark in the Incheon Declaration, the 15% goal. The second commits countries to ensure that the national recovery stimulus packages after the pandemic include actions and allocations for learning loss recovery, but also re-enrollment campaigns, training and skills development, and so on. So that's basically how emergency funding is going to be deployed and that education gets its fair share. And the third commits donors to increase their official donor assistance to 0.7% of gross national product and to increase the share of official donor assistance to education to match the levels that we saw in the early 2000s. That was around 15%. Let's remember that before this pandemic hit, annual global spending on education was approximately 4.7 trillion US dollars, of which over 2/3 was spent in high-income countries, and 22 billion, that's just 0.5% of the total, was spent in low-income countries. I'm putting up this contrast because those two groups of countries have roughly an equal number of students in school age. So there's a huge imbalance here. Globally, governments account for 79% of total spending on education, households 20%, and donors for just 0.3%. But if you go to low-income countries, donors can make up to 12% of educational expenditure. And I noticed that the original draft declaration included a commitment to ensure that education gets its fair share of 15% of ODA. Somehow that got lost from the version that we now have, and I think maybe that's something you may want to reconsider. But that's for our discussion later today. In 2017, median public education spending was 4.4% of GDP and 14% of total public spending. But in more than 40 countries, spending was below the Incheon benchmarks of at least 4 to 6% of GDP or 15 to 20% of total public spending. So there are a lot of countries not even before the pandemic meeting the goals that are established. Remittances are also very important, and in most years increase education spending by up to 1/3 in sub-Saharan Africa, Central or Southern Asia, and also Southeastern Asia. So what I'm saying here is that even the status quo before the pandemic was far from where education needs to be. And now we're looking at a global economic downturn with negative growth around 5%, and the GDP in donor countries projected to decline by 8%. And you can imagine what that's going to mean. So all sources of educational financing, whether it's domestic education budgets, household contributions, or remittance flows, and international aid, they're all under severe pressure. And that's what we need to find answers to in this session. The threat, of education budgets is going to affect all countries. But we should all be particularly concerned with those countries that are furthest away from the SDG 4 targets, and those are the low and lower middle income countries. In those countries, we estimate that the annual financing gap for achieving SDG 4 will increase from already now 148 billion to nearly 200 billion. Now, while our primary concern, of course, is to protect and wherever possible increase the volume of education financing, we shouldn't lose sight of opportunities for increasing value for money and efficiency. And otherwise, our deliberations here won't be credible to finance ministers. And indeed, the key theme of the declaration is how to invest now in education, such as remedial and re-enrollment programs, to reduce the run-on cost it would have of not taking action now. So those are the topics for today. Let us start. And Alice Albright, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Partnership for Education, will introduce the topic. Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Let me just make sure that everybody can hear me okay. That's a yes? Okay, very good. Well, it's wonderful to be here among so many friends and partners of GPE. So thank you so much for including us at this important event. I think that the declaration itself, we very much welcome it and very much welcome the focus that it has on financing. As many people know, there's a lot of work going on, advocacy work going on in the education community right now, and we're also very supportive of all of that work going on. So yes, let me in many ways echo, Andreas, what you've said in your opening comments. We know, of course, the pandemic has created the largest disruption to education systems in history, impacting as much as 94% of the world's student population. In the most recent statistics, 875 million learners were still out of school in 53 countrywide closures. At its peak, of course, of the pandemic, that number was 1.6 billion learners. The impact of the learning crisis, plus disruption, plus inequalities, is that some 23.8 million children and youth may drop out of school and may never, ever set foot in a classroom again. COVID's impact on human development is significant in all areas. In gender equality, for example, girls will face significant additional risks of child marriage and early pregnancy. And of course, the pandemic is pushing many more people into poverty, where we expect 150 million more children being pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. At GPE, we are particularly concerned about the impact the pandemic is going to have on education financing. According to latest forecasts by the World Bank, the global economy is expected to shrink by more than 5% this year, which is the worst contraction that we've seen since World War II. This will have an effect on public sector and education spending that is significant and fundamental in developing countries. Public expenditure on education is expected to fall. Even if governments are able to protect the share of money that they put into education, spending may fall by 8% in 2020. We also know that aid to education declined following the 2008 financial crisis because donors were not able to prioritize education. In many ways, the looming economic crisis has got the potential to be much more severe. And the UNESCO background paper provided for this meeting projects that aid to education will fall by something like 12%. That is up to $2 billion over the course of 2020 to 2022. Even this alone, we cannot afford to let happen. At the same time, we see that governments and education actors have reacted very quickly to the crisis. Developing country governments mobilized fast to mitigate the immediate impact of school closures. They launched and delivered remote learning initiatives on an unprecedented scale. And this has included radio, television, teacher training, and offline learning materials. At GPE, we mobilized our fastest and largest ever emergency response, which totaled over $500 million to help prevent the loss of learning and potential in over 50 countries. Just to give a couple of examples, in Guyana, the government asked us to support learning materials and resources to vulnerable groups in remote areas to ensure the continuity of learning where online learning wasn't available. In Liberia, GPE's funding has been there to support psychosocial support to teachers and students affected by COVID-19. And in Benin, the government sought support for teacher training, as well as remote learning platforms that will sustain beyond the current health crisis, ensuring more resilient systems in the future. By moving funds expeditiously, we've been able to help governments to keep learning going, to support the reopening of schools safely, and to strengthen the resilience of education systems so that they can be more responsive to future emergencies. At the same time, we must continue to take bold action and protect education financing to avoid what the Secretary General has called a generational catastrophe. As Andreas, you've said, the financing gap for achieving SDG 4 in the world's lowest income countries was already high before the pandemic, estimated to be as much as 30% of total cost. We would therefore urge member states and partners to invest in rebuilding education, building the human capital that is urgently needed for recovery and growth. Further, to relieve and postpone and restructure debt for low and lower middle income countries to create the fiscal space to invest in social sectors, in particular in education. And then finally, to sustain aid budgets. ODA must be protected and in fact increased because it is now needed more than ever. Country ownership is also a vital part of the equation. Domestic financing accounts for the vast majority of funding to education globally. So our attention must focus on how to help education ministries protect and expand their budgets. It is not just volume, but it is also efficiency and equity that matter. Addressing inefficiencies in the education system through improved monitoring, financial planning, and using data can help make the best of education investments going forward. In terms of equity, public financing, when focused on the most marginalized, can ensure access and quality of learning for a full cycle of education. And donors must get better at channeling aid through country systems. Unfortunately, we continue to see in many countries today, the effectiveness of support is constrained by a lack of alignment. A key opportunity upcoming to support all of these actions is GPE's next financing campaign. Last week, we launched a campaign calling on world leaders to raise your hand to pledge to fund and support education. We're very proud to say that Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom and President Kenyatta of Kenya announced they will lead this global effort. We're looking to raise at least $5 billion for GPE to help governments transform education systems in up to 87 countries, which are home to more than 1 billion children and 82% of the world's out-of-school children. $5 billion would represent nearly a third of discretionary finance available to education ministries in GPE low-income partner countries. As their own government budgets are being further squeezed by the economic fallout of COVID, our funding would give ministries the ability to pursue the reforms they want and need to make. It will help them unblock the most challenging bottlenecks in their education systems and to drive transformation. This is not only about raising critical funds for GPE, there's a much bigger opportunity here to use the most influential public policy platforms to focus the world's attention on the value of investing in education. With so many demands on public financing and all of the additional pressures wrought by the pandemic, we must work together to keep education firmly on the priority agenda of world leaders. I very much look forward to working with all of you in the months and years ahead to uphold our commitment to protect education finance at the time of COVID-19 and beyond. I remain confident that we can get all children back into school safely and that we can address the inequalities that have been laid bare and exacerbated by COVID. So let me end there, Andreas, and I'm very proud to be joined by all of the others on the panel and look forward to hearing from them from all of their remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alice, for setting the context for the commitments and also presenting what those commitments really mean. So it's time to get a sense for how they are actually taken forward at national levels. We have an impressive list of speakers from member states, the IMF, which I'm sure is going to give us a reality check on demands on financing, and also from civil society. But as always, we have limited time, so I do require all speakers to stick to their 5 minutes of time. And you and all other panelists and participants are welcome to post additional comments, questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And Charlene from UNESCO is going to monitor this, and our rapporteur will make sure that those get reflected in the outcomes from this meeting. Let me also remind you, you can listen to the interpretation in English and French, and you can do that by selecting the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. So time to start, and may I suggest the panelists to focus squarely on how you will very concretely take forward the financing commitments in the draft GEM declaration in your country, and particularly what other countries might learn from that. And I'm going to start with Nicolas Trotter, Minister of Education from Argentina. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas. On behalf of the Argentine government, I would like to greet all the authorities present in this meeting, especially each one of the Minister of Education participating in this session. This is a fundamental space for dialogue and the search for the necessary consensus that will allow us to overcome an unprecedented crisis as it is this COVID-19 pandemic, a crisis from which no country will be safe alone by itself. Since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, our ministry has held dialogues at regional and global level, including UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and the G20, as well as more than 30 bilateral meetings. All these meetings have helped us define not only the immediate response action to the pandemic, but also its consequences in the medium and long term. I am the Minister of Education of a country that has become deeply unjust, located in the most unequal region of the planet. According to CIPAL data, Latin America and the Caribbean, in a context of rapid growth in poverty, will suffer a 9.1 drop in GDP this year. It will be the worst economic collapse in its history, deepened by an unprecedented fiscal crisis. Protecting education and funding is for us a political imperative. It's also an ethical imperative to leave no one behind. It's not an empty slogan of the Argentine government. It's an action program. Carrying this out means, as our President Alberto Fernandez has argued, starting with the poor and most vulnerable to reach everyone. We value the call to increase the commitment of the families and the private sector to sustain our educational system. However, for us today, as always, the central role in this task must be exercised by governments, fulfilling their non-delegate responsibility to guarantee the right to quality public education for all. I want to tell you total clarity that the Argentine government will not take a single step back in our 2030 agenda commitment. We will not let the inheritance of social injustice that have been accumulated on our people and the complex and dramatic situation that this pandemic has imposed force us to do so. We will not get out of this crisis with austerity policies that repeats the regressive receipts used on the past. It will not be poorest nor the middle classes who will be paying the consequences of this crisis. For this reason, we have made an unprecedented growth in public investment in education by 2020, increasing our national education budget by more than 30%. This will mean an increase in the share of education investment in the general national budget. Next year will rise public investment in compulsory education by 80% compared to 2020. In addition, in education infrastructure, the project investment will be equal to 2.5 times the average investment between 2025 and 2020. The education inclusion programs and action will be increased by 81% compared to the previous year. Thus, the budget of a student scholarship will be double the investment in 2020. Moreover, all our scholarship and support programs for the student from the poorest family will be double their coverage. Furthermore, it's an essential in this critical context will be double our investment in digital resources, distribution of computer equipment, books, and texts in 2021 in relation to the current resource we have. During this month, we have carried out numerous support programs to guarantee the pedagogical continuity of our children. I highlight here the program Seguimos Educando, with more than 46 million copies of books for our school children. that have been distributed free of charge, as well as the production of more than 2,000 hours of radio and TV educational programs. We have created Juan Amanso platform with digital content and free browsing. At the same time, we have defined internet access an essential and strategic public service for national development. We have to invest more and better in education, but also need new and more creative education and inclusion programs that allow no children to leave the school, guaranteeing the re-enrollment of those who have dropped out of result of condition of structural poverty deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic. The compressing program Acompañar, Bridge of Equality, the Progresar scholarship system, the Education for Sustainable Development program, the new policy of promotion and expansion of the university system, the transformation of the teacher training system, the comprehensive sexual education policy, the policy to reduce gender gaps in education, the national reading plan, the national science plans, the goals of progressive universalization of early childhood education, and initiative networks developed together with social organizations for access to the education in popular neighborhoods. All the above mentioned are some of the actions that we have developed within the framework of the broad national agreement for educational equality, an articulated framework of the educational public policy will result to abandon those who most need the state role. Finally, I want to finish by sharing with you the Argentine Minister of Education is proposing the realization of a great manifesto in defense of public financing in education that we aspire to sign with all the Latin American and Caribbean governments. This will be an action to strengthen and consolidate the recommendation of the 2020 GEM Declaration. Politics is not just the art of the possible. Politics is the art of making essential what the powerful try to make impossible. A great global educational pact, like one that recently proposed by Pope Francis, is the only way to will allow us to leave no one behind, building a world of justice and equality for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Minister. I was very inspired by your commitment to keep to the 2030 goals on financing despite the difficulties. I think that sets a great example for other countries also. The way you set quantifiable targets for educational investments, I think, is a really good example. And to start with the most vulnerable ones to reach everyone, I think that's and the central role you outlined for governments, I think is a very, very important kind of the right tone for our debate today. May I turn to our next speaker? This is Karimou Salimon, Ministre des Enseignements Maternels et Primaires from Benin. And once again, to remind everyone, you can listen to this in French or English by pressing the interpretation button. Minister Salimon, the floor is yours.
Hey, bonjour. Je veux m'assurer que l'on me reçoit parfaitement.
Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me.
Mesdames et messieurs, en vos rangs, qualité,
Ladies and gentlemen,
de tout protocole observé.
All protocols observed. I have to say it's a great honor for me to be here in this eminent debate so that we can all talk together about education, which is the only superpower weapon for sustainable development in the world. In Benin, we have been involved in a number of agreements and conventions, and we have always invested in protecting our national education system. After the first COVID-19 cases emerged, all the plans and forecasts in order to achieve our objectives in the various sectors of our economy, including education, were of course disrupted. But so as not to compromise our sustainable development goals, a number of actions and measures were activated so as to protect the international and national funding of education, so as to mitigate the harmful effects of the propagation of COVID-19 in all sectors of our country. And within this context, the Benin government set education as a priority and increased the education government revenue 270 billion, 309 billion CFA in 2020, whereas in 2001 it was around 250 billion, which means an increase of 8.2% between 2019 and 2020, and 14.3% between 2020 and 2021. And this is not including the support of the various financial partners, in particular the Global Pact for Education. In order to protect education in this way, say in terms of national and international funding, the Benin government is intending to seek to reinforce innovative education funding through various partnerships. With respect to action already undertaken and those that we're expecting to undertake, the resilience of the Benin education system to COVID-19 has now been guaranteed, and its aftermath, of course. And I'd like to take advantage of this meeting to call on my peers, ministers for education around the world, so that all of us together, we can rethink and renew our actions and priorities for education. Education is the main driver of development in any country. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. I think your call for innovative education funding through partnerships, I think, has not gone lost, the same as your call for other ministers to join the review of policy responses. I think that's a very, very important point. And I think what you highlight from the example of Benin on strengthening not just individual, but also institutional resilience, I think that's probably a very powerful lesson from this pandemic as well. May I turn to our third member state, and that's Cambodia, Minister Hak-Chuang Naron, Minister of Education. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Honorable Ministers, Andreas Schleicher from OECD, Madame Alice Albright from TPE, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to meet all of you from a distance. I would like to thank the co-hosts for inviting me to share Cambodia experiences on the topic of protecting domestic and international financing on education. I would like to welcome the draft declaration, and I would like to share Cambodia experience as follows. Before the outbreak of COVID, we focused a lot on the implementation of reform program, especially the school reform program. With the outbreak of COVID, our priority focused on school health and promoting hygiene, and the campaign to promote sanitation, also to protect the children from COVID. With school closure, we launched digital education, and also we created e-learning system. And then we created a new digital TV channel in order to provide outreach to students without internet. We also use paper-based distance learning with teacher for those in remote area. In terms of financing, at the start of the COVID problem, the royal government of Cambodia required online ministries to reduce and save the budget in 2020 in order to reallocate budget to the health sector. However, even with the reprioritization of the budget, we managed to maintain the budget, but also to increase budget for 2020 by 9% compared to 2019. And the budget for 2020 still account for 17% of the current budget. Luckily, our government managed to maintain domestic revenue in 2020. And our projected budget for next year will be 2.5% increase compared for this year, as the government allow us to reopen school. We have reprioritized our budget allocation to focus on e-learning and also on school health, especially on safe reopening for school. We appreciate very much the contribution of our development partner who support us during the school closure, especially UNICEF, UNESCO, World Bank, Sweden, which provide around $11 million to support our ministry for the production of digital contents, classroom material, and development of distant learning programs. I would like also to thank GPE for the allocation of $7 million for COVID fund. As we now reopening school, we committed to increase the budget for school, especially to focus on health at the school level. And next year, our government even increase the school budget by 12%, 12%. And because our school reform programs have been implemented very well, we got an additional allocation of $50 million from the World Bank to expand the school reform coverage. And to match up, GPE also agreed to provide $10 million as GPE multiplier for additional fund to expand the school program. Our ministry continue to mobilize both domestic and external resources, and we are very grateful to our development partner for supporting the school reopening and also for continued implementation of education reform, especially to achieve SDG, to promote quality education, and also to improve student learning outcome. Indeed, COVID will stay with us for a longer period of time. Therefore, at present, we focus on new normal, also on blended learning and on digital education, as well as on how to promote safety at school. I would like to thank all of you for supporting our education sector, and we are committed to mobilize both domestic resources and also to maintain revenue collection, as well as to continue to implement education program in order to achieve quality education for all, focusing on inclusive education, on quality, but also on lifelong learning. Thank you very much and stay safe.
Thanks so much, Minister Naran. And actually, congratulations to your ability not just to maintain the budget, but in fact to increase it by 9% even. That's quite impressive. Also, the capacity of Cambodia to maintain domestic revenue, of course, is a very important foundation for all of this. I also was quite, struck how you have reprioritized spending, not just to address the immediate needs of the crisis, but also to look beyond the crisis into the future, reconciling health and education, also creating digital resources, not just to conserve existing practices, but to transform them. Your reference to also transforming teacher education through digital resources, introducing hybrid learning and so on. I think this is where the future probably is going to be. So very, very good examples, not just for spending more, but for spending differently in light of the needs for the future. May I turn to Priya Manikchand, Minister of Education from Guyana.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for putting this together. I think it's very timely. I think it's something we have to all address our minds to, and to make sure as we are doing that, that not only people in our countries, but that we don't leave other persons and countries across the world behind. So I think it was very timely, and I'm very grateful that this has been put together. The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted learning for over 8 to 9% of the world's student population. This pandemic has posed a real threat to children's education globally. Most specifically, children who are in vulnerable groups in Guyana, approximately 170,000 children, that is 100% of our pupils and students, ages 3 years, 6 months to 15 years and over, enrolled in public and private schools, have been affected by school closures. This forced school closure places at high risk the gains made to access to education and learning at all levels, especially for the vulnerable disadvantaged groups, that is, children with special education needs, and for those living in the deep riverine, coastal, rural, and hinterland communities. Where access in these areas is difficult and costly due to the densely forested and mountainous terrain, in this context, the highest percentages of the poor are in hinterland regions, 1, 7, 8, and 9, where the largest proportion of the indigenous population resides. These regions account for 33% of schools, 15% of teachers, and 18% of learners at the basic level. However, it should be noted too that there are communities in riverine areas and coastal regions that are considered vulnerable communities with similar levels of poverty as those in the above mentioned hinterland regions. The vulnerable group in the coastal areas account for 28% of schools, 18% of teachers, and 16% of learners. Overly and now notoriously delayed elections results exacerbated this disruption of schools closure in the governance of the country following its March 2nd, 2020 general and regional elections. During these 6 months, while we waited on the election results, learning continuity was limited and non-existent in some instances due to a lack of budgetary allocations, organization, and other common issues like connectivity. The assumption of a new government resulted in the tabling of an emergency budget, which focused on enhancing welfare by protecting the people in a COVID-19 environment. And that is the theme of the entire country's budget. Among the key priorities of the new government is the need to ensure the health and well-being of our citizenry are protected through the allocation of a 51.7 billion Guyana dollars budget to the health sector, which represents 15.7% of the national budget. The education sector was allocated 52 billion Guyana dollars, or 15.8% of the overall national budget. This, added to international funding from the Global Partnership for Education in the sum of 3 million United States dollars and an expected 7 million US dollars, enabled and will continue to enable the Ministry of Education to focus, expand, and enhance its efforts by facilitating more comprehensively learning continuity for all Guyanese students affected by school closure and upon reopening. These efforts include, but are not limited to, a reimagining, upgrade, and expansion of the Guyana Learning Channel on television to widen its reach to children generally and particularly in communities that do not have access to internet connectivity. This channel now offers daily timetabled lessons to students across the country in the nursery, primary, and secondary sectors. Radio has also been widely used to provide daily timetabled instruction and activities to our primary-aged pupils. The MOE, Ministry of Education, has also expanded its online presence through the upgrading of the ministry's website to provide access to structured teaching and learning materials, including textbooks and quizzes across levels to cater to children who have access to connectivity. As of this month, the Government of Guyana will procure and deliver home-based packages of worksheets and other learning materials for the first term of this new academic year to every student of this country. The ministry is mindful of the toll of this pandemic. the political situation in Guyana has had and continue to have on our students. As such, the government, with financing from foreign and domestic sources, will be providing the necessary psychosocial support for the students of Guyana. This combination of local and international funding has also allowed us to accelerate funding and preparation for a return to school by enabling the retrofitting of schools with adequate sanitization facilities and provision of PPEs for teachers and ancillary staff. Earlier this year, the IMF reported that the COVID-19 pandemic would lead to an unprecedented decline in global activities in 2020, to the extent that the global economy is expected to experience a 4.9% contraction. Latin America and the Caribbean countries are expected to contract by 9.1%. The uncertainty, shocks, and challenges in the global economy due to the COVID-19 pandemic will impact a commodity-dependent economy, such as Guyana. This government, however, remains resolute in protecting our human capital and has committed to maintaining and sustaining domestic and foreign financing in education. This is evident in addition to this year's budget allocation. A commitment is made to the people of Guyana and development partners to commit an average of 5 to 6% of total education expenditure as a percentage of the GDP in the medium term. Government has also leveraged additional IDA financing during this period to secure grants and other external funding to the sector over the next 4 years. Investing in bridging existing gaps in education is a necessary step during this time, as the lives of our future generation post-COVID depends on it. I thank you, and of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide any clarifications as participants may see fit.
Thank you, Minister. I think your efforts to reach learners in remote areas, not just through online learning, but also TV and radio resources that are often forgotten, but actually quite effective, I think is quite inspiring. Also, I like Benin, you bring up this idea of creating innovative partnerships for funding. That's probably something we should pick up in the discussion as well, not just on how to actually mobilize additional resources. Once again, we can come back to those topics in the discussion. May I just ask participants to post any questions, any comments they have in the Q&A section so that we can address them when we get to the discussion. Let me now call on Ansu Sani, Minister of Education from Liberia. You are not yet, you're still on mute,
Hello?
I think. Yes.
Hello?
Yes. Now what?
You got me now. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Professor Soni from the Ministry of Education, Liberia. Again, no need to repeat what my colleagues have said regarding the impact of the coronavirus. So that is the common denominator in all of us experience. It impacts some countries more significantly than others, especially small countries that already have some constraint when it comes to the health situation. But somehow, by providence, our country were able to move ahead fast because the experience we had from Ebola just 5 years earlier gave us a clue as to how to prepare for pandemic or an epidemic, if it were to be said that way. And so the earlier approaches we had and some of the leftovers from Ebola, like hand washing materials and all of those awareness information were in place. So when this other virus hit, somehow we were a little bit proactive. And so because of the experience we had before, so the impact, yes, it was very significant. It shut down the whole country. There was a state of emergency declared by the president, and and everyone was affected by this. The economy is slow to almost ending. The government was able to at least to maintain the health sector with support from the World Bank and EU and other Swedish government, other supporters, and then attention shift from everything else, including education. So on March 21st, we shut down all institutions of learning and major congregations in Liberia, all across the 15 counties of Liberia. We have about 2,800 public schools and 3,400 private schools, fifth base and all of that. And all of those schools were shut down across the country. Even though the impact was not the same in various parts of the country, it was more concentrated in the city limits, city region, but again, to be more careful, everything got shut down. So the migration of people were minimized. And so though the virus did invade other counties, but the impact was not as significant as it was in Monrovia, where it first hit. So what to do then? Everything remained shut for March, April, May, and then we have students that supposed to sit a regional exams for secondary school. And Liberia is among those regions, regional countries that take those exams. So we had to adapt and a strategy quickly to prepare our students. So in consultation with the president of Liberia, who had imposed a state of emergency then, gave us the authorization to get the 12th grade students to come back to school. So the 12th grade students came back, and they were the only ones in school then. They were in school from June 29th until they took the regional exam in the month of August. August from the 12th, there about up to the 2nd of September, from August 18. So when they got through with their exams, what we did then was to stagger the enrollment. So we brought in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th. Now the 6th and 9th also take an assessment exam and the standard exam. So we brought the 6th to 9th grade, which form part from the primary division, and they were in school until the 12th of October. Now from October 12th, the 6th grader took the exam, and October 14th and 15th, the 9th graders took the assessment exam. And then we enrolled the last batch, the 10th and 11th grade, who are in school now. They will be completing their rounds of school by November 14th, and all schools will have ended. The kids from the ECD division to 5th grade, we thought they were too small and cannot be easily controlled, and so we decided that they will learn from whom? Packages of lessons were developed by schools, and parents picked them up to their children. Now, I don't know how effective that really was across the country. I hope it worked, because we were not in every place. But that was the instruction, because you couldn't bring these very small kids. So up to now, they were not allowed to come to actual physical classroom. That particular batch.
Minister, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to ask you to come to an end because the next speaker is waiting already.
Oh, okay. Now, quickly, the universities are back in place as of October 12th, and they have some online blended learning and stuff. So they are continuing with both blended learning and online to complete their past semester. We hope everyone can now complete so we can start the next academic year. We have planned to start the next academic year as of December 1, which is a Tuesday. So the month of November is being used to put most of these in place. I just want to extend thanks to both the USAID that helped us with the learning by radio. We had some lessons taught on radio. We don't have the widespread television. So the radio lessons were across the country. USAID helped to pay for some of those costs. And it is that teaching by radio that we want to continue as a permanent platform, just in case of any other problem. GPE provided us emergency funding with supporting our EIE with 7 million. That 7 million is now going to provide, in part, the health kits for all 6,000 schools. Now, basically, GPE funding is going to the public school 2,800, and World Bank also supported the same program, but that's for private schools. So at the end of the day, before school begins in November, most of these schools would have gotten the health kits, the hand washing stations, and all of that. Now, again, this is basically what I want to say. This is our experience, since other folks have to come to speak. But the government, what the government was able to do was to continue to pay all of the civil servants, all of the teachers. So no teacher went out of pay, even though schools were closed. We're resuming that now. We hope everybody come back on board. We have some problem with the private schools because they are revenue earning and they could not continue paying the teachers. So the government did provide a small honorarium recently to share with private school teachers. Not their salary, that's just an appreciation and so forth. Thank you for listening. There are other issues, but let me give the other partners a chance to share their experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. And also another good example of how you have been able to keep your kind of financial commitments. And I must also say the way you have built on the experience from the Ebola crisis reminds us that we need to take the lessons from all of this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, with us to actually build and strengthen our education systems in the future. Now, may I turn to Marwan Aratani, Minister of Education from Palestine. You're next. You have the floor.
Thank you, Andreas. Pleasure being with you. So let me start first with the direct answer to the question. How are we handling the financial support for education under COVID? Well, unfortunately, COVID came at the time where Palestine was enduring certain financial limitations imposed by some international forces for whatever reason, I mean, mostly political. So we had issues with our income. It was cut down by more than 50%. I mean, the general revenue of the country, I mean, the GDP was cut down drastically. This is particular to Palestine because of the political nature of everything in the country. So I will not elaborate on that. So we had a financial crunch in the country to the point where we could not pay salaries. We have not been paying salaries to any of the civil servants in the country since May. We pay only a fraction of that salary. Not enough even for people to ride a car or to go to work. So it's been rough until today. You know? So that's one. Two, nonetheless, what we did was we tried to reach out for innovative in-kind support. We mobilized local resources from municipalities, councils, local businesses, philanthropists, NGOs to support schools to go through the pandemic. So what we did was a twofold approach. First, we decided, made decision to make our schools healthy and what we call it, like safe and healthy schools by providing them with the right renovation, infrastructure development, facilities, of course, all with the direction of making them, again, I mean, the water, the electricity, the playgrounds, the classes, so that we have less risk when we go back to school. That's one. Of course, support was given to us by some international partners like UNICEF, UNESCO, Save the Children, and some European partners, thanks to them all. Amazing stance under difficult conditions. So this was for health. Now, one can detail this. We had an elaborate health protocol, an amazing framework, I must admit, that we promoted through media, NGOs, every possible way, so that people have this awareness that we're going to school now with a whole different set of parameters for teachers, students, parents, and so forth. So that was good. We developed something interesting, what we call a Corona early warning system. It's a technology app, a very interesting one, and a Corona surveillance system, which is different. So we're monitoring so precisely what the impact of schooling does to the spread of the virus, positively or negatively. We don't know. So by region, by the socio-economic context, and so forth. So we're having this system linked to the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Health. So the minute we have anything happens anywhere, we have an immediate signal that goes to the principal of that school saying that this kid or that father who has kids in your school has been tested even. Before the result is out, we know that this person is being tested waiting. So anyway, this was quite interesting to protect our schools from incoming, right? The other thing is for technology. Now, of course, because we adopted a strategy for blended learning, that we do both. So we split the schools in half. So we teach half the time for half the students, right? So we never have the full school on campus, right? So Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and then the next week we flip, Monday, Wednesday, and then so within 2 weeks you have 5 days, which is anyway. So what we did in this sense is redesign the way we teach. So it is again quite an elaborate system whereby we made the curriculum thinner, leaner. So we focus on core capacities and not on the whole textbook. So we like the spinal cord of the thing, and then we develop weekly kits that go with the student to his home, standard kits. So we have also self-learning in school. We're promoting people, at home. We're doing that. It's not easy, by the way, to manage this because some parents say, for God's sake, I have 3-4 kids, I don't know what to do with them. So we're dealing with the implications of that. But the idea is that we're having independent home learning together with schooling. And in the meantime, to do that, we had to leverage digital online platforms. We created a platform under Corona, a very kind of rather ambitious approach. And we did that. We have an e-school system coupled with something called e-learn. And so we have put the material, everything, the contact between all parties in the school system can communicate through the e-school. A teacher with the parents, a teacher with certain groups, a principal with by region, by gender, by anything you want, by discipline. So we have this in place. The problem is that people don't use it enough because they're not, they're not used to this kind of thing. So we need to stimulate people to use it. We're doing, and we're trying to have indicators of how effective this is and so forth. Now, the other thing is we brought Microsoft Teams at large. We had an official copy of Microsoft Teams. And so the whole country, public schools, ANURWA, government, private, have Microsoft Teams. So teachers can go on the platform and have classes online. Whenever we have a corona, we close the school, we immediately go to distance learning through the MS platform. That we will do, again, not easy because there is some internet connectivity problems and so forth. Here I must say that technology, we called it a technology empowerment initiative because you have economic empowerment, social empowerment. You need to have technology empowerment. Why? Because you want to secure fair and equitable access to education. You cannot do that in blended learning without having the tools to do it. The big challenge we have is that people do not have computers. In this country, to be honest with you, we have only, I was surprised, I didn't even know that myself, we have only 37% of families have computers or laptops or iPads. Now, much more have smart mobiles, which is, all over the place. But the question is, are smart mobiles good for teaching and learning, especially younger kids and so forth? Well, that's an issue. Now, so we started investing in making devices available, not easy, very expensive, in a country which is, under the most critical financial crisis in our history. And the other thing is internet. We have no connectivity, so not all schools. So what we did is we agreed with telecom industries to increase the power of the internet wherever it is. And then the marginalized areas, now we have an initiative to reach all of them through a particular technology, because there is no communication there, there is no telecom. And the reason, by the way, this mosaic is a little strange because it's unique to Palestine, I think, because within the the current setup politically, the Israeli army controls what is called Area C. Area C is about 60% of the country, and they have total control there. So you really can't almost operate. To build a school, to get internet, anything you need to have the army's approval, and that can be quite challenging in a way. So again, accessing marginal schools is a challenge, because you don't want to just do it for the Ramallah and Hebron. Accessing Jerusalem is difficult, East Jerusalem, because of the the barriers and the closures. These are challenges we're dealing with. So we don't have a uniform learning environment. It is cut in pieces. Gaza is out of reach. Jerusalem is out of reach. Area C is out of reach. In a way, of course, not exactly, but very, very difficult to manage. So trying to kind of, manage a rather complex situation. Now, the other thing we launched a TV channel. The first time in our history, we have a TV channel for education. That was an amazing thing, because we reach more people without having an internet. But again, to build that and to have the right teams and the right, what we call a studio to take all of that. Now, the other thing concerning governance, if you allow me just one last remark, the governance is important. We decided that we cannot have a very centralized system of education under Corona. We need to decentralize and to give schools more autonomy. That is so challenging, because then, some schools have more virus than other regions for whatever reason. So we need to have them decide locally how to respond to a spike in virus, how to take measures. So we set up for each district a local committee by local government, by Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Social Welfare, Education and Health, 5 ministries. So anyway, so that we work in sync or in concert to support this blended learning approach and to protect. The indicators I have now are amazing, to be honest. I don't want to, exaggerate, but we're tracking the virus, and believe it or not, it is not bad. I mean, the way when we open schools now, we have all schools open, all, from KG all the way to 12. But again, as I said, half. No major thing. In fact, when we calculated all the NDCs, the ratios, you have to normalize and do the right thing. In fact, it is almost better than it was before, because outside school, kids go places, they play, they go to the malls, shopping centers, weddings. When they come to school, they come in a very disciplined environment, exactly how distant, who's your neighbor, what you do. So all that kind of is helping a bit. So it is flexibility. Flexibility means that we cannot be sure that we have the calendar year as always. Not true. So we may extend through summer, mid-year break. So in Palestine, we're floating kind of the academic year to respond to unforeseen rolling challenges, which is fine. So parents have to buy that and say it's okay, because people are used to a very rigid, centralized education system. Beyond that, we try to engage again parents and everybody. I personally talk to kids, parliaments. We have very strong children parliaments in schools, really strong, amazing, So I personally talk to them every once in a while, see how they feel about the situation. It's a whole new situation, because at the end of the day, the heart of the matter are those kids, nothing else really, And we have parents' councils, we talk to them also. So we try to kind of mobilize support for this. Now, the last challenge we have now, all that seems to be okay, is that because of the lack of money, the financial crunch, some teachers now are feeling uncomfortable, unable to kind of really go and deliver. So we're now dealing this week with issues where teachers are unable to even reach schools, and that is putting us in a bit of a, of a challenge, further challenge. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I think the situation which you started out with, the financial situation, was already difficult. It is becoming more difficult. But I think what we can learn from your experiences is that the resilience and creativity you put into solutions, the frontline capacity that you create, the way in which you link the digital world to the kind of physical world and create blended learning, also prioritized learning experience. I do think that flexibility and resilience at the front line is something that I think we will all need to see after the pandemic. Let me now turn to Paula Vilalta, Vice Minister of Institutional Planning from Costa Rica. Please, the floor is yours, Paula.
Good day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Andreas and Mrs. O'Brien. Thank you all for being here today. Dear colleagues, for Costa Rica, it's an honor to participate today. I want to talk about the experience of Costa Rica during these months of the pandemic. On March 16, just a month and a half after the beginning of the 2020 school year classes, the government of the Republic of Costa Rica issued the national emergency declaration throughout the territory due to the health emergency caused by COVID-19 disease. At the time, the Ministry of Education made a decision to postpone the face-to-face classes and began the new strategy for pedagogical mediation called I Learn from Home, which launched the guidelines for the support of the distance learning process. This gives relevance and pertinence to the use of the technological resources and the implementation of the distance learning. The project called Ministerial Platform Saber is in an execution phase and is one of the major projects that composes the program Know Digital Technologies at the Service of the Educational Community of the Education Ministry. For the first time in the history of the Costa Rica national education, this information system allowed the registration of all the student enrollment data by identification in an online mode for all the schools of the country in just one database. In order to continue funding it, we are articulating a bill of law to get resources to develop this digital alphabetization program. Now, knowing the actual enrollment of the educational centers, this speed up the projects to mitigate the impact in the learning process at closing schools. We started creating the institutional email accounts for all the students enrolled in the educational system, more than 1 million accounts to use on Microsoft platforms, among them Microsoft Teams for virtual learning due to the agreement between both institutions. At this point, there are more than 714,000 active users. It has been a successful implementation where we train more than 55,000 teachers. For students that do not have the technical resources, the distance learning strategies have been implemented using the autonomous guidelines printed, television and radio educational programs launched countrywide, as well as social emotional support for the entire educational community. One of our main goals is to increase the coverage percentage of the virtual learning, mailing to those students in vulnerable conditions and provide virtual platforms with digital resources. The student enrollment data collected not only helped in the previous strategy, it made possible to generate the interconnection of the educational system databases with other government databases, especially those in charge of ensuring poverty reduction. Thanks to this interconnection and data analysis, it was possible to identify students who do not have internet or computers at their homes. Ministry of Education requested the use of a special fund called National Telecommunication Fund, which objective is narrow the digital divide gap in the country. The project execution has begun to bring connectivity to 147,000 homes and 133,000 digital devices for more than 250,000 students, which are in poverty or vulnerability condition. This project will require an investment of $90 million for the next 3 years. The ministry has highly improved its public and private partnerships with international and national organizations, working to get opportunities to finance the different education projects through technical cooperations and non-reimbursable resources. For example, with European Union, UNESCO, World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank, among others. We have also optimized our internal processes to bring efficiency, and it is reflected in our 2021 budget, which yesterday and today is being under discussion to be approved in the National Congress. We need to keep defending resources to invest in our people, providing the best quality education, the one that they need and they deserve. No one should be left behind. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Minister. And another good example, in fact, I think Costa Rica is probably still the poster child in investing the biggest share of its national resources in its future in education. I hope you will be able to maintain that in the time after the pandemic. That was the perspective from member states. Let us turn to the international organizations. So we have next David Cody, Assistant Director of Fiscal Affairs in the IMF. And David, you have been monitoring the financial implications of the pandemic very thoroughly through the updates in the World Economic Outlook. I think we all be very interested in the insights that you have gained on social sector spending, and also what's your assessment of how education has been considered in stimulus spending? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me start by thanking you for allowing me to participate in this session. What I particularly appreciated was the very quick focus that was given to country experiences. These are kind of at the heart of how we engage with all of these issues. And we do believe that to move from rhetoric to reality, we have to bring the conversation and the discussion and the detail down to the country level, where the circumstances vary a lot and the constraints vary a lot. So I was really glad to hear and to learn a lot more about education every time I discuss with educational partners on these issues. Of course, you don't look to the IMF to tell you how to do online learning or how to deal with those issues, but I think you do look to the IMF to help us move this discussion from rhetoric to reality and to move at the country level. Our focus is very much at the operational level in countries. And we believe that at the heart of when we start first maybe by saying, the IMF, along with the international community, has been making funds available. Those funds tend not to be earmarked. They tend not to be had conditions. They're called the Rapid Financing Facility. The key point there is governments use it to address the issues they prioritize during the pandemic. Of course, the MD has said very clearly, the funds are there for you to use, but please keep the receipts. And I think the jury is still out as to how well that money has been used. And I think over the next 6 months, we're just finishing our annual meetings here in Washington in a remote setting. Over the next 6 months, country teams will be going to the countries and asking, and I think that's a big part of finding out how governments responded, how effectively responded, and how we can build on those responses. And I learned a lot from the speakers before me about how many new initiatives that are taken are not just a response to the pandemic, but actually are a response that can be built on going forward and address some of the inequalities we see in education. But I want to move back to my own domain, which is fiscal policy in particular. And at the Fiscal Affairs Department, we see that to move the country, to move the discussion to the country level, any discussion needs to be anchored in what we call a medium-term fiscal framework. This has to be at the center of the discussion. And there's a number of components here with a number of objectives. At the Fiscal Affairs Department, we provide an enormous amount of capacity development technical assistance in the area of medium-term revenue strategies. So any plan needs to be anchored in a medium-term revenue strategy. One of the reasons we're here is because we think it's difficult to get the resources, and there's lots of competition for those resources. So that medium-term revenue strategy needs to be anchored very firmly in strong revenue administration institutions, but also good fiscal policy. It also needs to be anchored on a medium-term expenditure framework. And this is where we interface with our sectoral colleagues like education, health, and so on. And for us, you don't look to us to tell you how to do education, but we do look to you to say, okay, where is your plan for education? Where is your medium-term expenditure framework, which needs to be anchored in turn on evidence-based policy interventions that have been proven to actually deliver good education outcomes. But a key component here, which is often missing in our view, is prioritization of expenditure. A medium-term expenditure review framework might come up with a number which says we need 5, 6, 7% points of GDP. You know, that's not sufficient. There needs to be a set of prioritizations, because you're not going to get 4 or 5% of GDP in spending in 1 year. So you need a set of prioritizations. But I think also what the medium-term expenditure framework needs to do, and we're dealing with this more and more, which is why we move very much to the country level, is the need to recognize the complementarity between investments. This was alluded to earlier in your discussions, where in particular in the area of social spending, that there's a large complementarities. Extra money for education cannot come at the expense of extra money for health, cannot come at the expense of extra money for social protection. We know those areas have strong complementarities. And this is why we want two things to happen in our view, and this is where we push it, using the medium-term fiscal framework to pull together all the sectors so that there's and it requires a cross-government discussion. Yeah, and we know from the challenge that it also requires an all of society perspective, because we will need ambitious reforms. And without a very strong social contract, you will not get those reforms, where you say this spending is needed for key areas that will benefit you. So we need to recognize those trade-offs. And in that sense, what we've done is we very much are mapping ourselves and trying to support the initiative by the UN and the EU in the area of integrated national financing frameworks, where they develop, they bring together development partners, and it's very important we come together at the country level. The integrated national financing framework brings together development partners to develop a coherent and realistic plan in the context of the broader SDGs as well. So this is very much how we're moving forward in the Fiscal Affairs Department. We did point out some year or so back, when we started to escalate our engagement, we did some estimation of the costing, the extra spending that's required by 2030 to reach the SDGs in education, health, and selected infrastructure. And of course, the numbers were a reality check, that we need very ambitious plans to attain those. We came up with numbers which, for education, for example, was around 4% each point of GDP extra by 2030, but health was also 5 percentage points on average, and the other infrastructure was greater than 6 percentage points, giving you about 15 percentage points on average. This tells you the scale of the plan and the need to be realistic and have a medium-term plan that you can actually implement. So this is very much how we look at this. We very much also want to move at the country level to work our teams to work very closely with our development partners and the country themselves, so that we have a kind of a coherent strategy among us. But we do believe, and I think I'd leave you with this point, that we need to develop stronger collaborations in the country across all of us, with the government owning, because ambitious reforms are needed. The governments need to own these plans. They need to have a society approach which has a strong close contract, because the reforms that are needed in terms of domestic mobilization, but also to use international funds efficiently, because in the low-income developing countries, it cannot be done by domestic revenue mobilization alone. We know that, it's very clear. So I'd leave you with that, and we look very much forward to working with the UN, World Bank, and others at the country level across the sectors to help develop those plans that are very realistic. It was challenging before, it's going to be even more challenging going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And I think your call to prioritize expenditure and also to build a kind of whole of society approach that brings the different sectors in establishing a medium-term fiscal framework, I think your call is quite well heard here. Last but not least, let's bring in the civil society perspectives. David Archer, head of the program development for ActionAid. You have followed stimulus spending as well from a civil society perspective and the impact on health and education in particular. What are you going to tell governments to protect spending on education amidst all of the constraints they're facing? David, the
thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas. And yes, I mean, I think if we don't use this moment of the largest health and economic crisis for a generation, in fact, probably for more than one generation, for bold propositions to shift the way in which we're looking at sustainable financing of education, then I think we'll be missing a big opportunity. We've focused for so many years as an education sector on the share of the budget going to education. And of course, that is important. It's critical that we maintain and increase the share of the national budget spent on education. But we have to, as an education community, start getting serious about more strategic financing discussions. And I welcome the fact that I'm coming after the IMF. I think we need to have much more serious engagement with the IMF, ministries of finance, on strategic discussions that affect the financing of education. For example, we really need to be, as an education constituency, deeply involved in the discussions about how do you sustainably increase domestic financing through action on the tax revenue that is collected. One of the interesting propositions and estimates from the IMF is that countries could expand their domestic, their tax to GDP ratio by 5% within the medium term, say 3 to 5 years. Now, if that was really set an ambition for country reforms of their tax systems, hopefully progressive reforms that can expand the revenue available for all services, that could be transformative. In fact, if a country expands its tax to GDP ratio by 5% within 5 years as a central part of its medium-term revenue strategy, that can actually allow a doubling of spending on education, on health, and on social protection. And you don't have to play one sector off against another. But we've got to get serious about taxing some of the biggest actors who are presently not paying tax in developing countries. ActionAid next week will be putting out some new research that shows just 3 big companies, if they were paying fair tax and the global rules for taxation of multinationals allowed that to happen, you could actually cover the 1.7 million shortages of nurses in 20 different countries, and you could do something very similar with education. So getting serious about tax has to be part of it, and getting engaged in medium-term revenue strategies has to be part of it. We have to talk about debt as well. I mean, for countries to have immediate revenue to spend, it is madness that there's some progress being made on debt suspension, not enough progress being made on debt cancellation, and not enough benefit going to enough countries. It is madness that countries are having to pay back old debts at a time when they're desperately in need of increased revenue to provide a credible response to the COVID crisis in health and education. But so dealing with tax, dealing with debt, but we've also got to get serious about macroeconomic policies, and particularly the policies of austerity, which continue to be supported around the world. Now, I really welcome that we have the IMF here at the table. I think it's a really significant step for the education community to do that. But if we're dealing with the gap between rhetoric and reality, this is one which we need to look at in the context of the IMF. Kristalina Georgieva has been putting out some very strong, bold statements calling for effectively for an end to austerity. But if you look at what's happening at the country level, and Oxfam and ActionAid recently did a mapping of COVID emergency response financing from the IMF in 79 different loan agreements, the return to fiscal consolidation within a very short time is still there. So we need to see the IMF practice shift from rhetoric to reality. We need to see it delivered on the ground at country level and not just in the mouths of some of the leadership in Washington. There is a real need in the field of education to look at the specific policies that the IMF is recommending around public sector wage bill constraints. This is probably the biggest #1 issue for education spending, because education budgets tend to be spent, about 90% of them are spent on teachers. Teachers are the biggest and most important cost in education, the recurrent costs for trained professional teachers, and there's still shortages of teachers. If you're going to employ more teachers, in the same way as if in health you want to employ more doctors and nurses, you are going to need to expand your public sector wage bill spending. But in the last 3 years, the IMF has advised countries very strongly to cut or freeze public sector wage bill spending in 78% of countries where loan agreements or policy advice is clear in this area. Unless the IMF shifts its positioning around public sector wages, we will not be able to increase spending on education, or indeed you'll have challenges also in the health sector. So we need to see action that gets beyond the normal discussions that we have around these tables, which are so focused on budget shares and percentage of GDP. Let's get serious about tax, let's get serious about debt, let's get serious about pushing for changes to that dominant model of austerity. Of course, it matters how the money is spent, and we have to look at the sensitivity of allocations of education budgets driven by a concern to increase inclusion and equity, and that has to be a big part of the discussion as well. And we also, I would say, critically need to add the need to look at making sure the money arrives in practice, scrutinizing whether education budgets are reaching the most disadvantaged schools in the most disadvantaged areas. So we need a combination of actions, but the things we have not been talking enough about as an education constituency are those big strategic financing issues of tax, debt, and austerity. And I think if we want to have serious discussions with the IMF and with ministries of finance at national level, we've got to step up the game of the education constituency to be able to engage in those in a meaningful way. That's the sort of transformation that we need now in the light of the deepest economic crisis of a generation. We need to be thinking differently about how we make the case for more expansive macroeconomic policies, for bolder action to expand tax bases in a fair and progressive way, and to end the debt crisis, which threatens to cripple not just immediately, but in the longer term, the financing of education. So I hope that the recommendations in the GEM declaration can pick up some of these other bigger issues, which at the moment are not strongly dealt with in the declaration. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, David. And I think you just opened a lot of really, really interesting questions for us to discuss. You know, how do we reconcile the needs of different sectors? How do we reconcile the needs of today with the needs of the future? I think these are all, very, very profound questions. I think the key point is to ensure that education has a strong voice in those discussions, which is probably not the case currently. But again, I think we have had very, very important perspectives on all of this. And unfortunately, we do not have much time for discussions. We're already out of time, but I do want to bring Minister Taisi Al-Nuaimi, Minister from Jordan, who has actually raised his hand for quite some time. But I'd like to ask you to be very, very brief, Minister.
Well, thank you so much, Andreas, and glad to be with you and Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really glad to be with you in this meeting, and I would like to just reaffirm our commitment in Jordan in terms of ensuring learning for all and working within the SDG 4 framework regardless of the hardships that we are facing due to COVID-19. Let me give you just a brief what we have done in Jordan. Definitely we planned early enough for the school year, and we developed different protocols, health protocols, education protocols. We were back to school on September 1st. Then, unfortunately, due to the escalation in number of cases, we closed our schools just last week. However, we shifted online immediately. The platform was available even as of September 1st for all students in parallel. We used hybrid model. Now all our students, around more than 2 million students, are following up their learning online. Teachers are at schools and they are providing support for teachers, whether learning support, psychosocial, and so forth. We kept during school opening the choice for parents whether to send their children or not. However, now schools are closed now. Last year we managed also to develop a platform and also TV channels that were broadcasting across Jordan. Students were following up that. And also we conducted 2 programs over summertime. One of them is a catch-up program to address learning loss, and the other one is a form of enrichment program, skills-based on that. However, before I go to financing of education and what we have done, definitely Jordan is part of this world. We were all affected. Our life were affected. The shift immediately to online learning, definitely this is a new culture in learning for students. We face some challenges in reaching out to all students. However, we did put in place different measures, whether providing them with tablets or bringing them to schools within their communities in remote areas. In terms of financing, expenditure in education in Jordan, public education, education sector, general education accounts for 3.6% of GDP, and the government ministry budget accounts for 11% of the government GDP. Because education is also a top priority for Jordan, His Majesty always put education as a priority. The Ministry of Education was the only ministry that its budget for this year have not been reduced. All other ministries, their budget have been reduced except for the Ministry of Education. I would like to take this opportunity to extend our deep gratitude and appreciation for all our partners and also donors who are helping us and continue to help us for the education sector, whether in providing direct budget support or direct support to the education sector, especially for the e-learning, for the inclusion part also of our strategy, and also in assisting the ministry in developing different protocols and programs for the marginalized and students in this regard, and especially also for the Syrian students. You know that Jordan was the most affected by the Syrian crisis. We have around 150,000 students, Syrian students in our schools, and they are still continuing their education, and their teachers also are connected with them. In terms of financing, most of our budget, as all of you know, has gone to salaries. Around 78% of our budget goes to salary, and the remaining goes either to operation budget or capital budget in terms of building schools or refurbishment and providing also equipment and so forth. So during this year, we made a quick review of our budget with the Ministry, Ministry of Finance, and we did the prioritization, and we focused more on and used the available budget for the safe going back to school in terms of providing schools with all health equipment and for students, including masks, and also addressing the needs of vulnerable learners in remote areas and students with disabilities, either by providing them with equipment or packages of internet and or some learning material in addition to the textbooks. Also, we are continuing to address the needs of Syrian refugees, including providing them with textbooks, accepting them with no conditions, and also providing access to them for our online platform.
Minister, I'm really sorry, we are out of time. We really need to go back to the plenary, so please.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just conclude that although there is a commitment that our budget will remain as is, but there is a concern that next year budget definitely might be affected during the impact of COVID-19 on the economy at large. But we are working closely with the Ministry of Finance to prioritize our needs on this regard. So the challenges are enormous, like on all other countries, but we are committed to providing our students the opportunity to learn online. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions and more importantly, for your leadership nationally and also for sharing your experiences here so openly. I want to thank UNESCO for its global leadership in these difficult times and also to provide such a fantastic platform for these discussions on a very important declaration. Let me thank Alice from the GPE as well as our speakers from the IMF and civil society. We did receive many comments and questions, both on the GEM declaration and also on the points that were made by speakers here. And we will definitely reflect them in the outcomes from this session and share them with the speakers. I'm not going to summarize our discussions because that's going to be done by our last speaker, Henriette Geiger, from the Director for People, Peace and Planet at DEFCO. Please, the floor is yours, Henriette.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for giving me that very easy task to summarize our discussions. I have to say thank you to all of you. It was really very encouraging to hear what you're doing across the world in this crucial portfolio. And I was astonished to hear that so much and so many, actually all of you reported that you have been able to protect your national education budget. I was very surprised. I'm not sure whether you were a positive selection, the lucky few, or whether this is something that happened across the board. And we also had a very important moment of peer sharing and peer learning. I think sometimes
this can be a very lonely job to fight for education in a government that has a lot of competing priorities and resources. Our Commissioner for Development Cooperation of the EU, Jutta Urpilainen, will speak of the European Commission's commitment to protect and increase national but also global education financing at the meeting of the GEM on the 22nd of October. And we also, as EU, she will also talk about the EU together with its member states will make important commitments on education in the future. I just wanted to say that increasing the overall investment is not enough. And I think this came out clearly in our discussion today, that we also have to ensure that the funds are spent in the right way and on the right things. It needs to be equity focused. Many of you said that, and you're making very concrete efforts, evidence-based and efficiently managed. That is key. There, I think there is still a lot that we can do. So we strongly endorse the messages in the GEM. We also think that we must avoid diverting scarce resources into high-cost solutions. Some countries may be able to have the luxury to do that, but most don't. And in order to reach those left furthest behind, we have to be creative. And I'm very heartened that many of you talked about radio, television, and what I liked most is that in Palestine, you have come up with local committees and delegated decision-making power to the local level in order to see how they best cope with the crisis. I think everybody has similar challenges, but the solutions can be different in the different contexts, and we have to look at what are the resources available at the local level. I also liked very much that some of you are engaging in dialogues with children and the youth, because this is also an untapped resource in terms of getting new ideas of how we can improve the education. One thing that we talked about is teachers training and teachers as frontline workers. And I think a lot needs to be done to invest in teacher training, because many of you pointed out the big bulk of the education budgets go into salaries. So we have to make sure that this is a key weapon for us. And especially in remote teaching, a lot of investment and skill training still need to be done. What we didn't talk about today so much is the efficiency of global education initiatives. And there we as global education community have a job to do. But so there's also the possibility that global education initiatives can share online tools. So not every country has to reinvest in online tools, but only adapt them to their contexts and idea sharing. And what was said by the Minister of Argentina about a global educational pact, the suggestion of Pope Francis, and what was proposed as the education manifesto for Latin America and Costa Rica is very important. This shouldn't be belittled, because we need political support out of the box. We are all converted. We all know what it means to invest in education, but those outside may have a need to hear more and to get some political pressure up. Finally, I very much want to support what was said about the whole of society approach for integrated human development. This is what the IMF said. We have to go outside of our educational box, meaning also we have to have the dialogue with the finance ministers and the whole of the society. And I very much want to echo what was said by Alice Albright and David Archer about debt relief, about tax collection, domestic resource mobilization. We have to go into that. And this is not a task where the education ministers can, which the education ministers can shoulder. This is a task for the broader donor community and the global community. One thing that was not mentioned is anti-corruption. It has been proven by many studies that effective anti-corruption efforts will yield several times the global ODA. So in times of COVID, we have to put the focus on that. Where can we get additional resources? It's not only about broadening the tax base, which in times of COVID is difficult, and reform of the tax system, but also look at the leakages. And finally, another point that was made strongly by just several of you was innovative partnerships on financing. And I know this is a sensitive subject because there we talk about public-private, and we all don't want that education is taken over by the private sector. But in terms of out of the box thinking, we have to engage. For example, ideas of national lotteries, ideas of having national telecommunication taxes, or partnerships with certain sectors to raise funds. All of this needs to be thought over and above of what we concretely do in education to get the leverage we need. I'm sure I left out many points, but I know we have to go back to the plenary, so I will leave it at that. Thank you very much, and thanks for your engagement across the world. It was very encouraging to hear. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Henriette, and see you all back in the plenary.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll see you later.